Thank you, Mandalee, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us for the Carryover Compliance Tracking and Requirements webinar, Part 1. Next slide, please. And thank you, Mandalee, for the introduction. You are all going to be hearing from these 4 panelists today. Next slide, please. And in this hour, we are going to walk through the AB 1491, give you a policy overview of the member carryover tracking, consortia carryover tracking, triggered actions that are as a result of the excessive carryover. We will walk through the written expenditure plan that is now published, provide some sample scenarios, and equip you with tools and resources. And lastly, open it up for questions. We will be monitoring the questions that are coming in through the chat, but also we'll give you an opportunity to unmute yourself and provide questions, answer questions at the end. Next slide, please. Starting off with AB 1491 Carryover Compliance Overview. This legislation impacts Education Code 84901 and 84914. The legislation was actually passed in 2022. However, the state offices began tracking the carryover compliance requirements at the start of fiscal year 23-24. It took us some time to roll out and release the policy guidance and implement the structures to be able to track. Essentially what this legislation does, it addresses the actions related to carryover of funds from a previous fiscal year to the next. There are 2 key parts to the carryover compliance legislation that we hope you are able to take away from this presentation today. They do track concurrently and have an impact on one another. However, there's 2 separate aspects to this legislation. One is centered primarily on the member level. It is assessing whether the member has excessive carryover. The distinction with that is the excessive carryover is not called out in legislation, a particular percentage threshold. The consortia and the members have an opportunity to designate and define how they're going to track excessive carryover within their bylaws and capture that in the CFAD. In legislation with member level carryover, member funding for 1 year may be assessed. It is assessed on an annual basis. However, it's being tracked for a consecutive 2-year period that will then prompt some actions, which is what we're going to walk through in today's presentation. The consortium level, which is the additional tier of carryover compliance that is being tracked, is an impact that is assessing the overall consortia carryover. And legislation specifically calls out a 20% of exceeding 20% of carryover. And this is assessed annually and monitored, is being monitored by the 2 state agencies. Legislation calls for consortia that exceed 20% carryover will be required to complete a written expenditure plan and assign technical assistance by the state agencies. We will cover that more in depth. Next slide, please. We have released state policy guidance. This was back in 2023. As we mentioned, we have just completed our first year of tracking. And AB 1491, we refer to it now as carryover compliance. Guidance had been released, a timeline along with an FAQ. A lot of what these resources are aligned to is primarily the policy aspect. When we're talking about carryover compliance, and I'm having to explain the complexity of this policy, is looking at it from the two angles. There's the policy aspect, and a lot of those questions that are arising from the field answers can be found in the policy guidance that you see here. There's then the technical aspect, and that's everything that you see in NOVA and how we merge the policy and the technical components together. And we will certainly walk through to be able to provide you with some greater clarity. Next slide, please. All right, handing it over to Neil.
All right, thanks, Myra. So I'm just going to quickly go over a little more detail from what Myra explained. And so focusing on the member carryover, the key things to remember on the legislation, you have to determine the member carryover. You have to decide majority vote. You have to decide what is excessive carryover, and it has to be tracked for 2 consecutive years. So you could potentially have opted out this year, opted in this year. So then that when you opt in, that starts the 2 consecutive year clock. Or you could change what you say is excessive carryover. You could have had 20% last year and now you're having 30% this year. So there's a lot of variation in the member side of carryover, and it's really up to the consortia, like it says here, to authorize what's going to happen. And so including the reduction of the members' allocation. And so you would determine that percentage as well. So on the member side, there is a lot of flexibility and a lot of decision making by the consortium. Next slide, please. So here are some takeaways on the member carryover. AB 1491, the carryover legislation, authorizes but doesn't mandate for member carryover reduction. Excessive carryover is determined by the consortium and its members, and you do that through the CFAD every year. So you could, one year you could have, like I said, 30%, the next year you could have 20%. So there's a lot of variation going on here. It's still with members must be 2 consecutive years. And then if you do opt in and you do have a member that's 2 consecutive years, you can't reduce by no more than the annual carryover percentage. And then the funds that you reduced are only related to the carryover of that fiscal year. It doesn't affect any base allocations going forward because we have ed code that says you get the same amount as you did in the prior year. So this carryover reduction can't impact that base funding. And then finally, when you do that majority vote, it has to take place once Q4 is certified. And in the legislation, it says it must be a majority vote. So if you have bylaws that are different than majority vote, some have consensus, some give votes out to, this member gets 6 votes and this member gets 1 vote. It's a majority vote and a 1-on-1 vote. So that's a little different maybe than your bylaws. So that's something to consider as well when you look at the member carryover. Next slide, please. And then here is in the CFAD where we have that member carryover that Myra was talking about. And so you can dive into that if you want. You'll see this when you open your CFAD. Next slide, please. And then here is a comparison between 23-24 and going into this year using the CFADs of how many people or how many consortia opted in. So we went from 26 opted out in 23-24 and only 15 opted out in 24-25. So maybe that's trending towards people are feeling a little more comfortable, and so they're moving to opting in. So if they opted out in 23-24 and opted in, then that starts the 2 consecutive years for the member carryover, if you're following that. And then you can see the thresholds. Everybody, most everyone's in the middle with 20%. There are some ones that are going a little bit way above 20%, and then there's a few that went below 20%. So you can see the range there. Next slide, please. And then here are just some key takeaways for member carryover. Consortium needs to establish some clear governance that addresses the implementation of this and accommodations of the legislation. You might want to reevaluate your bylaws or review to see how they align, because it is very different than maybe your current bylaws, especially on the voting. Another key takeaway is tracking members and assessing them annually, figuring out what that locally determined technical assistance would look like. and what that intervention means. And then consortia need to fill in gaps on, the funding reduction, the voting process, the timetable, the check-ins, how to utilize any reallocation of funds. So a lot of consortia decisions have to be made when you're looking at the member side. And then consortium members can use the tools to assist in tracking that's available in NOVA. And I think we're going to go over that a little bit later. And then if you opt out and do nothing, there's still the consortia 20%, which is taking into consideration all your members anyway. So you might want to think about the member consortia opt in to at least have some way of holding everybody accountable so you don't get over the 20%. And I think a lot of people have done that. So next slide, please. And then here we get to the consortia carryover compliance, which just triggered what was that, September 30th? And so we have about 33 that will have to submit a written expenditure plan to the chancellor and the superintendent. And the legislation says prescribe and assign technical assistance to that consortia to ensure adequate adult ed services and are provided to the region and proportionate to the region available funding. So we'll go over this in just a few more slides. Next slide, please. And then here are some key takeaways on the consortia carryover compliance. We're in year 1 of tracking. It began last year, 23-24. It closed just less than 8 or 9 days ago once Q4 was certified, and that was on September 30th at midnight or just before midnight. The start date included the tracking of both member and consortia level carryover, but as you can see, consortia level carryover is a constant. The member carryover has some variation. You can change the percentage, you can opt in, you can opt out on the member side. So a lot of variation as compared to the consortia, which is always 20%, and there's no opting in or opting out. And it takes in consideration of all the members' grand total for the consortia. And then consortia carryover may include 1 or more fiscal years of funding that's in the excess of 20%, different than the 2 consecutive years. And then consortia carryover includes carryover all its members. And that's why tracking member level carryover throughout the year is critical. Next slide, please. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Neil. So I'm Susan Wynn from KAI Partners. I'm going to go through some NOVA screenshots here. Since we have some limited time, we're going to go through the slide deck instead of actually going through NOVA right now, but we'll see what happens. Compliance tracking, there are a number of actions that are triggered depending upon what happens with the carryover thresholds, both for the consortia and with the members. And these appear in NOVA. So compliance tracking and identification, then we're going to look at member carryover and then the consortium carryover. So next slide, please. Carryover compliance is calculated in NOVA upon Q4 certification, which we know we just had that. That was September 30th, 11:59. And you may have noticed some of these have popped up in NOVA now. If a consortium has carryover in the fiscal reporting section of NOVA, a tag appears next to the consortium names, and the tags that will be visible next to the member names are carryover compliance 1 year or carryover compliance 2 years. For consortium, it's always carryover compliance, 1 year, because that's assessed on an annual basis, the consortium carryover. So if we go to the next slide, please, we'll see an example here. And this is a screenshot that I recently took, and we'll thank Alan Hancock again for being an example, but this is it's they're like the first one listed on here. But this is in the left-hand side, we see the fiscal reporting, and notice that I took it to 24-25 quarter one because Q4 is now completed of 23-24. So on the right-hand side of the screen, we see the reporting period stated 2024-25 quarter one, and there's a little legend that tells you the meaning of what CC 1 year and CC 2 year means. And if the flag is in the top upper right-hand corner of the little box for the consortium and its members, if the flag is in that upper right-hand corner, then it means it's for the consortium. Otherwise, if it's for the member individually, it will appear after the member, as we can see in the Antelope Valley section. Now, one more thing that I want to point out is that Alan Hancock has 2 members, not one. Only one member can be seen, so don't panic. And remember that we're in fiscal reporting and a budget has to be approved in order for the members to show up to be able to assess against or fiscal report against. So the other member just hasn't completed or had approved and certified their budget in the member budget and work plan section of NOVA. So that's a reminder there. I have a little sentence. Individual members appears member budgets are completed and approved. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Keep this moving. And so when a member's quarterly expenditures are entered, NOVA will automatically calculate carryover percentage for that quarter. Remember that the carryover threshold is set in the CFAD. But should the quarter's carryover percentage exceed that of the correction actual fiscal reporting quarterly threshold, a corrective action plan appears as required within the member's fiscal reporting area. And the corrective action plan is a single narrative asking for an explanation of the steps taken to become compliant. So if a consortium member has carryover and they exceed their internal carryover threshold, they will need to complete a member corrective action plan. It's the moral of that story. So if we go to the next slide, please. And after 2 consecutive years, I know some questions have been asked about this. After 2 consecutive years, if a member has exceeded their internal carryover compliance threshold for 2 consecutive years, then a member allocation amendment utilizing the new carryover compliance selection may be made. And those amendments are found in the consortium and members section of NOVA, the left-hand menu, navigation menu. You just find your consortium and then you scroll down to where the allocations are, and there are buttons that say start amendment. And if we go to the next slide, please. When we start an amendment, we can see that now one of the options is you have to select, why you're doing this. Is it due to the May revise, standard member transfer? Is it a new member? Or is it due to carryover compliance? And then you also type in the member selection. So this is available, but we have not completed 2 years yet, so we won't be using this yet, but it is there now. So if we can go to the next slide, the final thing we have is for the consortium. If in the fiscal reporting submenu of NOVA, when you find your consortium, it shows the tiles of consortiums. You click on the tile, goes into your consortium. At the very top, there's a ribbon in NOVA, which gives you a little summary for the consortia, where the consortia as a whole is for its carryover. That completes that. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to hand this over to Myra to talk about the written expenditure plan.
Thank you, Susan. So the written expenditure plan is one of the triggered actions that has populated as a result of this first official year of tracking. And as legislation states, for consortia that have exceeded 20% carryover as an entire consortia will be flagged in NOVA and will be required to complete a written expenditure plan. The written expenditure plan is available in NOVA. Neil will walk us through the questions in the later slides. The written expenditure plan populated this time around, given the new testing of this new rollout in NOVA, and this is a first year of rolling out this legislation as well. So the period of when this became available was on October 1st. September 30th is the snapshot that occurs on an annual basis, ensuring that Q4 is continuously certified either before or no later than September 30th is going to be critical. The written expenditure plan has 45 days to complete, and it runs from October 1st through November 14th. And we will talk about, I've been hearing a possibility of a request for extensions, and we'll cover what the written expenditure plan entails as well. Next slide, please. So the written expenditure plan in NOVA that is now available, the consortium lead will receive a notification and alert to complete the written expenditure plan in NOVA once the Q4 is certified. You will also see this notification at the top of the NOVA dashboard as a new requirement and on the consortium's main screen. If you haven't already, log into NOVA and you will be able to see if you are being prompted to complete the written expenditure plan. Whenever the consortia submits this written expenditure plan, we've had some questions around the awaiting submittal status and what does that mean. So during this time, the members are in a status of awaiting submittal, where they are waiting for the written expenditure plan to be submitted before it can be approved. The member status does change and the plan may be approved by its members. It does require approval by all consortia members. The color will change on the awaiting submittal status, so please don't let that throw you off. And if you do have any questions or challenges, please feel free to reach out to us through Cape Tap. Final approval is going to be provided by the state office. Both the California Department of Education and the Chancellor's Office representatives will be reviewing the submitted written expenditure plan and either follow up with the consortia representative that is designated on the plan to inquire on any further questions, or will proceed with approving the written expenditure plan. Next slide, please. And this is just a snapshot overview of how it looks in NOVA. For consortia that are flagged, as Neil mentioned, this cycle, we have about 33 consortia that are flagged. So 33 of you should be able to see this trigger in NOVA, asking you to complete the written expenditure plan. Next slide, please. This is an example of how that written expenditure plan looks in NOVA. I recognize one thing that we were considering was the need to develop a template. And we also recognize that for the most part, you're going to be completing this, within the consortia, talking to your members. Do know that there is the functionality. If you click on the share button, it'll allow you to print a PDF template of this in case you're needing to use that in conversations, in meetings with your members. Next slide, please. Legislation for the consortium carryover tracking calls for two things, as we've covered in previous slides. If the consortia is exceeding 20% carryover on an annual basis, they get flagged, they'll complete a written expenditure plan. And legislation also calls for the state to assign technical assistance. The technical assistance is support, is to ensure the support of effective use of funds as specified by policy to provide adequate adult education services to the region. Essentially, with the carryover compliance tracking for the consortia, funds are not taken away from the consortia. The actions are completing a written expenditure plan to ensure that the field is, the members of that consortia are assessing that carryover, making decisions to best allocate, expend those funds that ultimately benefit and serve the needs of that region. We will be assigning technical assistance for those that are flagged to ensure that the members are working towards that expenditure plan. Technical assistance will be provided by our Cape TAP, both SCOE and NOSI will be available to help provide additional support. Next slide, please. And my last slide, consortium carryover compliance tracking. So as we've mentioned, as of October 7th, there were 33 consortia that have exceeded the 20% consortium carryover threshold. There were more consortia that did not, the majority of consortia managed to submit and certify their Q4 expenditure. As of right now, there are 2 consortia that are outstanding. However, we're going to need to work with those consortia that still managed to submit and certify their Q4 after September 30th, 11:59. There's a reason, there's a snapshot that was taken on September 30th, 11:59. Therefore, for those of you that know you certified post that date but have managed to certify, I recommend you look at those at the carryover amounts, and we have a slide where we're going to talk about the terminology, the terms, the technical terms that we have in NOVA, because as you're looking at these enhancements, you'll understand what the various definitions and terms mean. And for those that did not certify in time, but have done so already, we want to assess and to ensure that the carryover amount that was captured is accurate. Otherwise, please reach out via Cape TAP, and we will be looking at those consortia. And for those 2 that have not, critical to ensure that we get those Q4 expenditure reports certified. And you can see a percentage breakdown of where these consortia and their carryover percentages stand. We have 7 between 20 to 25% of excess carryover, 10 between 26 and 35% excess carryover, 51% and over, there's a total of 9. So it is critical to be assessing the member carryover. That essentially is what is triggering this carryover compliance as an entire consortia carryover. Next slide, please. I will hand it back over to Neil.
All right, so let's get into the written expenditure plan. Question 1. Okay, I'll go over these quickly. We'll see if it makes sense to you. You can always ask questions. So in 23-24, did your consortium have an option internal member carryover threshold? That's pretty easy. You either did or you didn't. So you can answer that one. 2 and 3, Myra kind of showed this on the NOVA page, but it's those boxes where you list your consortia funded members and their carryover amount and the percentages. And the way you can find this is you just go back to NOVA, go into your individual members, and you look at the Q4, and there should be the percentage carryover, whether it's under 20%, over 20%, some are like at 6%, some are at 54%, but it's all there calculated for you, so you don't have to try to figure it out yourself. It's already there in NOVA. If you filed your Q4, it should be sitting there waiting for you to add if you do have to fill out this written expenditure plan. Question 4, describe the circumstances that led the consortia to exceed consortia level 20%. Carryover threshold, include information about specific members. This is where you could say, oh, we were putting money aside for building or our financial or business office didn't, certify our expenses. They were too late, or so you have an opportunity to explain what happened. And I know there's all kinds of circumstances that could happen. Maybe you're saving money for a big capital outlay project. Maybe there's a delay in certification of expenses. There could be any number of reasons why you had that 20%. And as you saw from Myra's slide, we do have, a number of them just barely over the 20% mark. So maybe that was unexpected. Maybe you thought you were going to be under the 20%. And so easy fix, in your budget and work plan, you could show that, yes, you're going to exceed that carryover or spend down that carryover by Q1, Q2, however you deem your spend rate. Question 5, describe the support the consortium has attempted to provide consortium members to reduce the excess carryover. This would be your internal support, or if you've reached out to TAP in the past. So this is your opportunity to provide the state some background on what kind of technical assistance, whether you're having your monthly meetings or some kind of direct intervention with certain members. Maybe you've reached out to TAP, maybe, there could be any number of instances where you provide that support to that member or members to reduce the excessive carryover. Next slide, please. And then question 6, what is the proposed consortia level corrective action plan and timeline to reduce the excess carryover with members and thus the consortia? So this is your opportunity to tell us your plan. And I don't know if the timing's right, but your work plan and budget could be that opportunity to show how you're going to spend down that money. And that could be something that you share with question number 6, because everyone's working through the budget and work plan. It's not due to be certified until the end of October. So you do have an opportunity there to use that budget and work plan as a way to show the timeline and maybe the corrective action of reducing that excess carryover. Question 7, what types of processes and protocols will be implemented to ensure that current and future consortia and member level carryovers are reduced? And so maybe you have monthly meetings or quarterly meetings and you go over your NOVA expenditures, projections. That we're going to talk about any number of tools that are available that you can use. And so maybe you're going to embrace some of those tools. So this is your opportunity to explain, those processes and protocols and what that looks like, and gives the state a better understanding of how you're dealing with it. And then question 8 is your opportunity to provide information to the state on support and technical assistance needs that would be helpful to your consortia to assist in the reduction of excess carryover. And that's where we get to next, the 16th. I think it's October 16th is the part 2 webinar, which we're going to have the technical assistance providers be available and go through that process. And so that should help you understand maybe a little better on question 8 and what kind of support and technical assistance can be available from the state in helping you reduce that carryover. And then the last question, question 9, you provide your contact information. Okay, next slide, please. So here's a quick question. Does my written expenditure plan need to have local board approval? So the answer is it depends. And this is why I was referring to your member work plan and budget. So if your members' work budget and work plan align with your proposed consortia level corrective action plan and timeline, I think that was question 6, to reduce the excess carryover, then there would be no need to obtain additional local board approval, but please check your bylaws as this may vary by consortia. So when you're working on your budget and work plan, you might, you're getting your consortia certification by the end of October. that could align with your corrective action plan as well. So take a look at that. Take a look at your bylaws to see, whether you need additional approval, whether you can use that approval for a budget work plan as your local board approval. But just keep in mind the written expenditure plan must be developed with member input, because they're going to be certifying that once it's submitted. So all members have to certify that before it's submitted to the state. Next slide, please. And here's another question. Do all members have to approve the written expenditure plan? And I just answered that, yes. And then next question, if I can't make the November 15th deadline or due date, can I ask for extension? Answer, yes. If you require an extension, please contact Cape Tap. And then last question here, who will review my plan? Plans will be reviewed and approved by CDE and the Chancellor's Office. So just so you know. And next slide, please. And I think I turn this back to Mandalee.
Yeah. So this
Alrighty.
is just a reminder. It's a quick graphic to show you the tools and resources that you really do have at your fingertips. The Nova has all of those fun dashboards now. You has the forecasting tool, the ribbons, all of the triggers and flags are really there to alert you to your fiscal expenditures, where you're at, to continue to have those conversations with your members. And then if you need additional assistance, and that's where your TAP comes in. So whether that is our NOCE arm or our SCOE arm, the TAP is here to support you in various ways, whether that's a one-on-one Zoom, helping you navigate Nova, talking through maybe having a thought partner in how you are going to reduce that carryover. Does that look like a program? Does it look like expanding? I've said it 1,000 times, we understand that we have 71 consortia, all with various students, all with various members, and all have unique situations that we're here to help support you. So there's not a blanket answer always, but we're here to support you through that. So you can reach out to us and then we can help you. In addition to that, we are planning on providing additional webinars and TA. And with that, we also have surveys that we're sending out. And I don't know, Lisa, if you want to speak to that now, might be a good opportunity.
Sure. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Diana, if you could go ahead and drop the link to the carryover compliance survey in the chat. Many of you have already responded to the survey that was deployed sometime last week, and the Cape Tap Integrated Office is very rapidly gathering those survey findings so that we can incorporate specifically what consortia are seeking for the Part 2 carryover compliance webinar next Wednesday, as Neil mentioned. And while we won't necessarily be able to cover every issue of every consortium, we are endeavoring to listen to the consortium in terms of what they are seeking for this technical assistance webinar. And I responded to a question regarding technical assistance. We recommend that you attend next week's webinar. And then if you need additional, more customized support, by all means, reach out and we will arrange for one-on-one. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. So with that, I think that's really all I'm covering here. I'm going to turn it back on over to Myra.
Thank you, Mandalee. I'm going to hand it over to Susan. She'll finish this off. I did want to plug in, we do have a slide as we await the remediation of this slide deck. Please note there are some prior presentations and slides that we have presented January 2024 that really went through something similar, NOVA enhancements, the legislation, the policy overview as well. So there are a lot of resources that are currently available as we await for this slide deck to be remediated. Susan, I will hand it over to you.
Okay. I'll close this out with some more resources that we have here. Just showing some screenshots of the dashboards that are available in, well, reports and dashboards that are available in Nova now. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen in the menu, navigating menu pane, we can see that under reports, there's a little caret arrow that goes downwards. And under that, there are two types of reports: monitor reports, which are just for your standard regular quarterly activities that you can keep track of. And then now there's a new carryover reports section. And in that carryover reports, there are a number of dashboards. You do need to remember to dial in the year that you want to be looking at. 23-24 is our first year of measuring the carryover. All of these, if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. These are underneath these dashboards are underneath the one in the previous screen, and all of these are drillable, so you can double click into them and you can drill down. So it's in the carryover reports section. You will find dashboards, which can also lead to reports when you double click on them. And sometimes it takes Nova a few minutes to load that up. Certainly, if there are any issues with that, please report them if they don't seem to be working properly. We have tested them and hope that they do. It seems like they do for us, so they should for everybody. Can we go to the next slide, please? And this is a closer look at one of the dashboards that just gives an idea how we can see things all through quarters. It's a visualization. All of these bars are drillable into. If we go to the next slide. The next two slides cover definitions and terms for Nova and for carryover compliance. I'm certainly not going to read all of these. They can get cumbersome, but it is brief definitions. So we've included them here for you to hopefully help out. If we can go to the next slide too. Oh, I thought there were two of those. Sorry, there should be two. Yeah, there we go. So we've got explanations of FIFO, and then as we move forward, we get more into the AB 1491 or carryover compliance legislation. And the process of earmarking, because that can get confusing. And if we go to the next slide, I think that brings us back to support from the tabs. If you require support, this is your portal for it. And I'm going to pass this over now to Mandalee to take us out.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, so I think I've dropped the link previously. The best way to get support from the tabs is to use the support request button. You can find that on our website. We'll drop the link here again shortly. And I want you to know that all of our, both teams are addressing any of those support requests that come in. And whatever that might look like for you, you can always email us direct at tap@caladulted.org. We're here really to support you and help you in the health of your consortia. So, and then additional resources. I think I'm also covering that. So the additional resources are items that Myra has already covered and talked about. They will be in this slide deck. I also just popped in the link to the January webinar. It has the recording as well as the PowerPoint, and that PowerPoint has most of, if not all of these slides as well. And this is the opportunity to also, if you haven't already registered, to whip out your phone and use that QR code and sign up for the upcoming webinar part 2, which will really be providing you the TA and what that looks like in regards to carryover compliance. And with that, I think we are now, we have about 15 minutes to support you in this moment, especially with our CAPE leads in the room, with any questions regarding carryover compliance. And then I see Shannon, you have your hand up.
Hi, I was just hoping that we could, I really apologize when Neil was going over this. I looked away for a minute, so I really apologize if it was stated. But on, let's see, page 4 of the written expenditure plan. So we do have to enter in zeros or in A in all the slots. I get that. For the final / adjusted allocation, So would that be our total budget? I want to make sure I'm clear on the terminology. So if, let's say we put our member name, then the next column, let's say our allocation for the year is 200,000, but we have carryover of 50,000. Are we putting 250,000 in that box?
I'm just going to go right back to the slide, and then I think Myra was about to come off of mute.
Yeah, this is in reference to the written expenditure plan, correct?
Mhm.
Yes, and it, well, I printed it out and it looks like page 4, where it has like all the grid, like 1 through 20.
So it's on slide number 24.
Okay.
Once you are listing your, I think it's question number 2. Once you're listing your members, this one right here, are you referring to
Yes.
the final adjusted location? So we are working to clear up the language to provide better clarity, and also include some added helper text. But essentially what that final adjusted allocation is soliciting, we're looking to capture what the members carryover balance is, what their carryover amount, if any, is what you're going to report on that section there.
Okay, so it's not the allocation, actually, it's the actual carryover amount.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Okay. It looks like we have some questions in the chat. There was some earlier, and I think Neil's already addressed that. A new one came up. Sorry if I missed it, but where can we see the dashboard that Susan Wynn showed us that can be drilled down into? And that is, here I'll fast forward. Apologies for the quick moving. So when you are in Nova, on the left-hand side of your navigation bar, you'll see once you select CAPE, Carryover Reports. This is the Carryover Compliance Monitoring. When you scroll down, you will see these drill down reports following. Does that answer your question? Great. All right, are there any other questions? This would be an opportunity where you can either raise your hand and come off mute or pop that into the chat for us. Wow, not seeing any questions.
This is Linda Bernabe. Hello, Monthly. Just to
Hi.
recap, I guess it's due November 14th, but in case we might need an extension, we can apply for that through CAP, CAPE, sorry, through CAPE. And it seems like whether the board has to approve it or not, it will be a local decision. Okay,
Yes.
thank you so much. I see Neil nodding as well. Perfect, thank you.
Mhm. All right. And I'm just scrolling through chat to see if there's any other questions, but again, feel free to come off mute.
We have a question from Valerie Suzuki. Is there any way to have Nova's quarterly reports to report the fiscal lead portion of funds separately from our own adult ed funds, because it gets a little cloudy with the exact carryover percentage amounts that are individual or the consortium as a whole?
I do know that this, request and this question has been brought up previously. At this time, that is not an option that we have available. Essentially, the member receiving the funds is the legal entity responsible for those funds and reporting according to that. Also, those funds are not exempt from the carryover as we are looking at it as a whole. However, please note though, if that is impacting either your member carryover or the consortia carryover, in the various narrative sections, you have an opportunity to address that If it's in your written expenditure plan, we'll certainly be reviewing and taking that into consideration. But at this time, we're not able to separate that. But you do have an opportunity to write that explanation and also try to address that carryover amount as well.
Myra, you do have the opportunity in the budget to separate out admin costs if you wish, but it doesn't trickle into the quarterly expenditure reporting. But it might help when you're developing your budget currently for the year if you want to separate out those admin or consortia level costs. Might give you a better picture, and that would help you maybe draft your written expenditure plan or figure out, how you're going to spend down.
Okay, thank you. I see that Janice has posted a request, and that is just to have the reporting of consortium funds needs to be completely separated from the member carrying the consortium common cost. At the last reporting, their indirect was still combined. And then I see Valerie added to that. We do separate in the budget and work plan to Neil's point, but it does get confusing that we only report it all together.
Angeli, I also saw a question about registration for part 2 of the carryover compliance webinar series for next week. That was already sent, correct? That registration?
It sure was. I'm sorry, I didn't see that one. It might have been a direct message, potentially, but we can go ahead and drop that again in the chat. The carryover compliance tracking requirements part 2. All right, and Eric, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, so if we're in year 2, so if so many projects sometimes get carried over because they don't finish by the end of the fiscal year. So we can, did you say, Neil, that we could encumber those that money that was allocated for those projects that didn't get spent at the end of the fiscal year to the following year?
It really depends on your business office or your accounting office of how they want to represent that. We don't really have any say in that. I know with purchase orders and things like that, it's really up to you, and they have to follow their generally accepted accounting principles and practices, and they get audited. So it would really be their call on how they want to represent that in the expenditures. So sorry, I couldn't give you a definitive there.
Thank you.
Okay.
I
About
did
5
want
minutes
to.
left. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I did want to plug in, and you'll probably hear more about this in the part 2 webinar. There's 33 consortia, as we've mentioned, that have this excessive carryover, and an opportunity that you have as in the next webinar, they're going to talk about allowable expenditures, different opportunities as you're assessing how to address this excessive carryover. The 3-year plan is going to be a perfect opportunity for you to come together as a consortia and assess how you are also forward thinking, looking at your excessive carryover, what are those needs of your region, and how you're going to utilize those funds that you have available in order to meet those needs. It is trickier during the year because you will need to ensure that as you're trying to expend your funds, it's in alignment with your member budget work plan, your annual plan, and your 3-year plan. So this is an opportunity to be proactive and capture your plans for expanding your funding in the 3-year plan. Then we'll follow the annual plan, and as you develop your member budget work plan.
Well, I'm not seeing anyone else come off of mute or raising their hands, so I think we'll give you the gift of 2 to 3 minutes left. There are some great links that we have included, so this is an opportunity for you to download and save the chat or grab those links for the evaluation, for the carryover compliance survey, which really will inform our next opportunity to come together to talk about technical assistance and how Cape Tap will support you through that. So please take this opportunity now to go ahead and please save your chat. And then I will close out. And as a reminder, once we have the PowerPoint remediated, which should happen sooner than later, by the end of the week, everyone should have the PowerPoint in hand. We will also share the recording once it's received from our third-party vendor. So until then, we hope to see everybody. Thank you, Holly, at the summit this October. And we hope to see you back here online with us next week. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Bye.